everyone. It's Naomi Wolf of Daily Clout, and I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to have a special guest today, the wonderful Steven Maslow. Mr. Maslow is a number of important things in this community and outside of this community. One is that he is our acting CFO, but more importantly, he was trained by the great John Boswell, Dr. John Boswell, who was also my professor, who was one of the great historians of the Middle Ages. He wrote a groundbreaking book about same-sex love in the Middle Ages, extraordinary man. And he's, well, we can talk more about Dr. Boswell and his impact on me and on Mr. Maslow, but Mr. Maslow is also here today to talk about and contest an essay I wrote and to talk about the kind of prevalence of using the metaphor of Nazism in public discourse. Mr. Maslow also has a deep background in this from having been trained by Elizabeth Young Bruhl, who is the biographer of Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher of totalitarianism and a refugee from the Nazis. And as well, what Mr. Maslow and I both share is that we both descend from refugees of or survivors of the Holocaust. So welcome, Mr. Maslow, to this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. It's an honor to be here and dealing on the content side of the equation instead of the bookkeeping side of the equation.
Well, we're grateful to you for both. And one reason I really wanted to have this discussion with you is that you and I see one specific thing very differently. And one of the things we like to do at Daily Clout is showcase civil disagreement, rigorous debate that is constructive. So you take strong issue, and I respect you so much. I wanted to invite you onto this forum to hear your thoughts. You've expressed them very eloquently in a guest essay called On the Subtlety of Metaphors, and that was in response to my essay on the subtlety of monsters. So I will just say as a headline that my essay made the case that we were in a time right now in which there were echoes of the pre-Nazi era when the National Socialists were gaining influence, gaining power, 1930 to 1933. And you very eloquently feel that the metaphor of Nazism should not be used in the way that I have. So let me turn it over to you and your argument. And if I've misstated your argument, please correct me.
No, I think that's fine. We fundamentally agree that we're in a dangerous period for democracy. And we can also fundamentally agree that the early 30s and late 20s were a dangerous period for democracy, especially in Europe, especially in what was then the Weimar Republic or the Federal Republic of Germany. So we're in agreement on those points. I think where we disagree is I feel that there are drawing an analogy between the programs that the United States government is doing, which I like to think of as well-intentioned but flawed. Drawing an analogy between that and the policies, what was going on in Germany in particular in the early years. Hitler came to power at the end of January of 1933 through some elaborate maneuvering. There was a period of the downfall of democracy, certainly in Weimar Germany. But I don't feel that that's an appropriate analogy to draw on, because this is one of these things that as soon as you invoke it, you slide into what comes next. Mm-hmm. Okay? Extermination camps, medical experiments, the enormity of the horrors of the Third Reich. I don't think we need to, recount them and remind people, the gory details of what went. We all know it was the low point for Western civilization, for civilization period. But I find it I'm very troubled by the idea of saying that a government which is coercing people into getting vaccinated in the middle of a pandemic is the same thing as the those things that led to the seizure of power by the Nazis, or the National Socialists, as they were called, in the early 20s. I want to add to that, and then I'll let you respond a little bit, is that I don't think that I think it's important to remember that there was nothing surprising about what the Nazis actually did later on,
Mhm,
after they were in power. The
mhm,
horrors that they perpetuated came as no surprise. They were outlined, in Hitler's autobiography. The name in German is Mein Kampf. It was a bestseller in 1924.
mhm,
It was read by many people, including Stalin.
mhm,
Stalin was, very famous for having read it and was afraid of it.
mhm.
And in it, he outlined very clearly what was going to happen and
He
what they did.
Hitler outlined very clearly.
Hitler outlined, yes, he had the extermination of the Jews, of the Jehovah's Witnesses, of the Gypsy people, also known as the Roma people, also known as the Sinti people. Forgive me, I'm not up to, I know they have names that they're particular about, and forgive me for my ignorance for not knowing the right ones. And like the destruction of Eastern Europeans people in order to make room for an expanding German Empire, also known as the Lebensraum program. These things were all talked about in that book. And then we must also add that the leading newspaper of the party, of the Nazi party, if I may call it that, was it's called Völkischer Beobachter. I guess you would translate that to mean the people's watcher or something, or the watchguard of the people, I guess is how you'd say it in English. And that was a daily paper as of 1923, and all these things were openly discussed. It's just that they were so grotesque and so horrific that I think, no one would believe that they would actually do that. But they did.
Right.
Um, and so on. So I raise these points because I realize in your essay you're at great pains to distinguish between the early period, when the Nazi movement, and I use the word movement very advisedly because the Nazis never referred to them, I shouldn't say never, but very rarely referred to themselves as a party. They referred to themselves as a movement, and also they used the term revolution. They were a revolution. And this word movement, which is the same in English and German, implies, large numbers of people going along with something, and also physical movement, and which they were characterized by. I know you're at great pains in the Monsters essay to distinguish between the early part of things when they were seizing power and what came later, but I want to put it out there that you can't invoke one without the other. And so that's why although I understand where you're coming from, I disagree about the appropriateness, the aptness of that metaphor. Okay.
So thank you for so eloquently laying out some very rigorous and reasonable concerns that you have about my having drawn, and I recognize, dared to draw, right, a comparison between some of the things that are happening now and a time, a very specific period in history, 1930 to 1933, where I saw similar things happening. I take your point. I guess I want to respond with two things right off the bat. One of them is, I think there's an intellectual temptation to read back into history what happened later. And that's why I'm so interested in, and that's always a mistake, right, in my view, because people don't know in 1931 necessarily that in 10 years on, there would be death camps, right? That hadn't happened yet. I totally take your point that Hitler had said, in effect, that there would. But I see people doing this a lot with, the kind of woke movement to stigmatize history in a new way. Like, why, how can Thomas Jefferson be a hero? He had slaves. Well, it's so important to not project backward into the mind of someone in the 18th century ideas that hadn't been developed yet about, like, the universal rights of men and women, and that you can't own another human being when slavery was part of the economy around the world, and so on and so forth. It's not to justify it. It's just to say, everyone, including ourselves, are prisoners of our time and this state of consciousness. And people will look back at us in 2022 and say, how did they not know X or Y that we know now? So to me, I guess, as someone who respects you so much, I feel a little bit, in a debate about, is it right or wrong to say 2022 in some ways looks like 1930, 1933. You're kind of folding in my view, a later moment in history into this very kind of specific tranche, and saying, well, by talking about 1930 to 33, you really need to fold in 1939, when they began to, do systematic, dragging of the disabled into,
right,
where they died, or
I'm saying that the connection between the two periods, or the what came first and what came is like almost automatic.
Totally agreed.
Yeah.
Totally agreed. But it's a tricky debating posture, because a lot of people, including Chamberlain, didn't see the death camps, right? Chamberlain made a peace in our time, a pact with Hitler, right? I mean, the Mitford girls were, swanning off to Germany to observe the glamour of the National Socialists. I have a book which I treasure, because it's such a kind of relic of that ignorance of history, right? It's from about 1931 or 32, and it's these two young gay Englishmen, upper class Englishmen in their early 20s, doing a tour of Germany in their little sports car in 1931. And they're like, well, this isn't good. There are Nazis in this town, but there's wonderful Braunschweiger and, delicious, Weiss.
Weisswurst. Yeah.
In this other town. And you're like, how do you not know what's happening? But my point is, a lot of people didn't know. If they did, all of our relatives would have been out by 1931, 32. And a lot of people stayed. Like, all the victims later didn't leave because they still thought, this is bad, but it can be okay. So I just want to say that. But before you respond to that, I just want to throw out one more thing in response to your opening, Sally, if you like, which is, there are, to me, when you say, let's say it is legitimate, and I see that you can make that point, right? People should have been able to see from the clearly racist, going back to the 20s, going back to the turn of the century and before, ideologies around the Jews and getting rid of them, and Lebensraum and so on. People should have been able to see what was about to happen. To me, when you have commentators on CNN and MSNBC and political figures saying these people shouldn't be able to buy groceries, these people shouldn't be able to go to school, the fact that I'm coming to New York at the end of the week and I can't, we're racking our brains, not just you and me, but other loved ones. I can't walk into a restaurant in Harlem, which knows about discrimination, but anywhere in the island of Manhattan, and it's 5 boroughs, because I am not vaccinated for a very good medical reason. That to me, it is impossible not to use the same logic you're using and say, well, if people are willing to create a 2-tier society in which I've literally been shut out of, many benefits of society, right? Like I'll just mention one, the Common Good. It's a fantastic organization. It brings together heavy hitting influences on both sides of the aisle. I can't go to an event with Huma Abedin on Monday indoors without Alan Patrickhoff because I'm not vaccinated. So how is that reality? How do we not use your logic and project forward 5 years to a time when, we're the ones being taken away from all the healthy, good, blessed, much more wealthy because all the stuff has been given to them, vaccinated population? Let me ask you that.
Okay, I'll start with the second part of the what you said first, and then perhaps we could return to the earlier analogy part. The answer to that is, throughout American history, in times of crisis, there has always been a suspension of liberties in a temporary way to cope with those crises. The earliest example I can think of would be the Civil War, during which time Lincoln effectively suspended the Bill of Rights.
Yeah,
they didn't exist. When there were draft riots in New York City, they were brutally suppressed by Union troops in Brooklyn. When you look at Grand Army Plaza and the giant arch there, that was put up so that people would forget. It's a monument to the victory of the Union Army during the Civil War. It stands on the place where police and other armed, Union forces gunned down draft riders, and the people, they didn't want that to be remembered. So in times of crisis, oh yeah, or one can think with horror horror of President Franklin Roosevelt, who, we can say many things about and is generally regarded as the good outweighed the bad, generally.
Yes.
Okay, Order 9066. He imprisoned American citizens of Japanese descent, first generation. Imprisoned them, right?
Yeah,
took away their homes and their businesses. I mean, no, I'm just saying it's a horror, but it happened temporarily in wartime.
Right.
Because we just don't have the time to handle the wheels of justice, which, as we know, grind slowly, but they grind. So in the crisis of what has happened here, in the crisis of the pandemic, I believe nearly 1 million Americans have died now from the spread, with this tragedy of proportions. And it is well known to me that people like you, and who share a point of view that is not in favor of vaccines.
Not correct. I'm not in favor of mandates.
Not in favor of mandate. Forgive me. I'm sorry. I know that it is not because you're in favor of harming anyone else, and far be it from that. Okay, I get that. But in temporary measures have been throughout our history enacted that are later repealed, and we learned something from it. I mean, Roosevelt's infamous Order 9066 about the Japanese Americans was far less drastic than Lincoln's suspension of the Bill of Rights entirely. And nobody was gunned down in the street, and he didn't build camps in which people were exterminated or gassed. Yes, they were economically terrible, and reparations were paid, and it's highly doubtful that such a thing would happen again. I'm sure we'll think so. That's my answer to your question. Like, that's why this place is not like that place. And also, the Nazis clearly telegraphed from a very early time what they were going to do. You're talking about a group of people who, beginning in 1920, were violent terrorists by nature. When I say terrorists, I mean they deliberately inflicted harm in order to scare more people, because they didn't have the numbers until the period of time that you're talking about. So they led a revolt against the Weimar government in November of 1923. Was the Munich It's called the Beer Hall Putsch, where Hitler and some loose coalition of his other right-wing types, the famous brown shirts and so on under Ernest Röhm, they tried to violently overthrow the government, and they failed. Um, and so on. I mean, they were killing their political opponents, in particular the Communist Party, the members of the Communist Party, which were a very large party in Germany. You have to, at that time, I mean, as they were in America, actually in the 30s also, there were many of them. They were gunning them down in the streets. They were capturing them and torturing them. They were doing all kinds of things. I mean, like, their behavior metastasized, but it came as no surprise. And they always intended, when they ceased, to do exactly what they said they were going to do. Whereas I don't think that's true of the US government at all. I don't think the US government ever wrote a manifesto that said, we are going to deprive this group of people. All laws discriminate to some extent. And let's face it. I mean, they well, when I say discriminate, I mean they favor one thing over another thing. That's what a law, I mean, that's the effect of a law. But if you do it on the basis of race, it's pretty unjust. If you say that we're going to give a tax deduction for people who are going to build, say, solar power things, that's going to come at the expense of some other group. In that sense, I mean discriminate. But society as a whole will benefit from it, because it is felt, will free us from dependence on fossil fuels, which have been, like, there's an element of discrimination. It's not being done. We're not saying, God forbid that this particular group can benefit from building, but that group, you see what I'm saying? Like, well, discriminatory policies are very different.
So I hear what you're saying. Let me tease that out a bit, okay? Sure. You're saying, if I understand you correctly, that one major difference between now and COVID policies, broadly speaking, and the just pre-Nazi era in Germany, is that the leaders of the Nazi movement were clear about their intentions and had a manifesto about how useless we were and our grandparents were, but that this government doesn't have a manifesto and isn't creating wholesale discrimination. Is that your argument?
On the basis of race, or I think that yes, and also remember also the Nazis from their inception were engaged in violent and terrorist seditious acts.
Correct.
Right. Whereas our government is not.
Right. So let me gently press you, because I think there are a lot of people watching who do agree with you, and a lot of people watching who really do not agree with you. And sure. I don't, for the following reason. First, I'd like to challenge the notion that we are in the middle of a pandemic based on the data. One really striking thing to me about how the data have been presented, and this is something I've been a real nerd about throughout the pandemic, is that the data are presented very selectively, which is a story I broke like 15 months ago, and the New York Times has finally caught up with it. But the point is, when you do the math correctly, and everyone who dies of COVID is a tragic loss, or who dies with COVID, but there are a couple of things to just share, for your thought about whether this is indeed an emergency that is comparable to the Civil War, comparable to World War II, right? Because I take your point. In a real crisis, there have been times that liberties have been suspended in our country and in others for the duration of the emergency. The first thing that really blew me away was when I looked at the death tables in Massachusetts in the middle, like the height, like November 2020, height of the pandemic, right? And I saw that the average age of death was 84, which is 6 years older than the average lifespan in Massachusetts. So what that means, which is really interesting, is that the people, and it's hard to say this in the right language, but the people who are dying of COVID or with COVID are not random living people. they are disproportionately such that the average is 84 people at the end of their human lifespans, right? They're the group of people who die. And I don't mean that harshly or without compassion. It's just an important demographic point. So when you say 1 million people have died, that is correct. But if the average age is 84, and I haven't seen the numbers extrapolated state by state, but it's important to know what the average age is,
Right.
then what you may have is a lot of people dying at the end of their natural lifespan.
Well, yeah, I don't think the average age of the million that we've lost to COVID is 84, but it may have been in the state of Massachusetts at one time.
That's
We
fair.
do know,
Have that data.
we do know that that when it first struck, it hit the elderly, especially elderly in nursing homes or those kinds of institutions, uh, hardest of all.
Right. So let me move on. So you're right. We have missing data, and as the New York Times is pointing out, we have a lot of missing data.
No, you were absolutely prescient in pointing out that the data being presented was not only selected, but like selected in order to produce a certain like result in the population,
Yeah, I'm not trying to say, how smart was I, but just to kind of tease out this notion of, is this an emergency? The other piece of math I want to share, and I know that you're much more of a numbers person than I am, but this is striking to me as well. My poor mom was so distraught because what the Oregonian, her local paper, was reporting every day was, in Oregon, the COVID cases have gone up 20%. And then I would drill down into the numbers that they were using for that headline. It was 9 people out of all of the millions of people in Oregon. And then I did the math for Oregon and Massachusetts and New York correctly. And the math goes like this. And this is true for every state. When you take COVID cases, infections, right? What is an infection? Leaving that aside, even as loosely defined as it can be. And then you divide the population of the state by that number, and then you map that number against, and people who die with COVID, right? And then you map that against other causes of death. Repeatedly, COVID deaths or deaths with COVID come in at 8th or 10th cause of death in that state, meaning below opioid overdoses and below suicide. And that was true in Oregon. And when I explained that to my mom, she kind of calmed down. It's not that any death is good, but people are innumerate, and the media has helped them be innumerate. And I would say if the 10th cause of death or 8th to 10th cause of death, COVID, is lower than the 9th cause of death, opioid overdoses, the 8th cause of death, suicidality, then we have even more of an emergency around people committing suicide and people dying of opiate overdoses, but zero attention, on a massive scale, a massive mobilization. Like, we don't consider that we have to close everything down, make sure no one's depressed, make sure everyone has opioid overdose treatment, or get intervention for free if they're becoming dependent on opioids. The whole society, we certainly don't just suspend civil liberties because people are killing themselves or people are dying of opioid overdoses.
I see that. Although, forgive me, I haven't looked into the statistics, these kinds of statistics, which I'd be happy to, but I'm just having difficulty squaring in my mind, in the last 24 months, 1 million, let's call them COVID related deaths.
Okay.
Maybe deaths that occurred prematurely having something to do with COVID, and that being a number which is lower than the US suicide rate in the last 24 months. That doesn't make sense to me.
It's worth mapping state by state, and something that has become clear is that the CDC data only report 31 states. So,
Right.
but also, like,
Yeah.
people, I mean, for that number to be meaningful, we'd have to know how many people have died of other things in the last 24 months. And if you've got a population of 330 million, you're going to get millions of deaths every year, right? So,
Yes, no, I do understand that, but I do think that whatever it is that we're talking about as vaccines and safe distancing procedures and mask wearing were rolled out, it had an enormous impact on those numbers.
really,
On this enormous, yeah.
it's interesting.
So and then if you so these are a long time ago, when confronted with whether or not he should use the British government as collateral for the financing of the Suez Canal, the then Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, threw up his hands and said, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Okay.
Statistics.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
let's leave that aside because we're
Well,
not.
yeah, leaving that aside for a second, I think, we could get into the number, but I really, I think that it's fair to say some kind of medical crisis was thrust upon us 24 months ago. And at first, when we took no measures, the suffering was very, very great. And as we took more measures, the suffering ameliorated. I think we can both agree that thank God that, that is showing up, that is passing now. I mean,
So it's a really interesting moment, Steve, because I think you and I get very different information streams about that.
yeah,
The data and the commentators that I most respect
yeah,
conclude, and this is becoming more of a mainstream view, have concluded that lockdowns didn't do anything and that masks are not helpful, and that Borla himself said to the financial news on television about 6 weeks ago, vaccines give you little, if any, protection. So I don't mean to be going into the rabbit hole of did they work, did they not work. I want to move on to, because it could be
well,
like
no, but it's a really good point that, as many of your points are, a really good point that you're raising. I really doubt that suspending the Bill of Rights helped the Union armies trounce the Confederacy during the Civil War. And I certainly know that Roosevelt's imprisoning first generation Japanese Americans did little, if anything, to help the war effort in the Pacific. But I do understand why these things in the midst of a crisis were actions that were taken, because had they not been taken, panic might have ensued and worse outcomes might. Yeah, I do understand them, and they were repealed and rolled back. And hey, lo and behold, you may be absolutely correct, but surely we were witnessing all around us the return to some kind of pre-pandemic normalcy. I don't know if we'll ever go back to what we were, but it's getting better.
Certainly, I mean, the people I respect most,
Yeah,
like the Barrington Declaration signatories, said in November of 2020, standard epidemiological wisdom, this will roll through the population, people will acquire natural immunity, there will be herd immunity, and then it will get better, it'll be endemic. So again, you and I have different information streams. I do not, but we don't have to go down that rabbit hole because we have a bigger subject.
No, yeah, the big thing is that, that's very different in my mind from a government and a group of a movement that set out from the beginning to destroy whole sectors of the population.
So let me go to that point because I want to head back. Like, to me, people could debate all these minutiae forever, but what's really important, I mean, all the things you're saying are important, but what is so important to me, why I really wanted to have you debate these issues with me, was the question, is it ever appropriate to invoke the Nazi metaphor? Because it's flying around a lot. And I think you make really, really good points about it not being appropriate. So now let me go to what you just said about another difference, right? Which is this government is not targeting, groups of people specifically. So I just want to say, as an American, to me, when my president said, you who are not, he said, we're getting fed up, or, we're losing patience with you who are not vaccinated. I can't tell you how terrifying it is to be an American citizen whose president is saying, I'm losing patience with you, with all of the power that represents. He also named individual people as the dirty dozen, guilty of misinformation. Peaceful citizens, not insurrectionists, not traitors, peaceful citizens expressing their points of view. And then lastly, I was due to go fly for a week with my mom and my relatives last Christmas, booked the Airbnb, bought the tickets. The day that he gave a big speech saying, your loved ones, your families, your communities are facing a winter of severe disease and death, right? The family vacation was called off and I was stuck with unrefundable plane tickets. Point being, that was based on not science, because vaccinations do not affect transmission or infection. But he was using the bully pulpit to single out a group of people for vilification. And then much more seriously, because that's just a plane ticket, millions of Americans have had to have their First Amendment protected religious feelings overridden for an injection that they don't believe in. And millions have had to lose their jobs or lose their careers, be kicked out of the military. I spoke at an event in New York for first responders, our heroes, right? Firefighters, police officers who are being fired, or laid off, losing their careers, losing their benefits.
Because they choose not to be vaccinated. They're being coerced into being vaccinated.
Right. And I just want to say, you respect the rule of law. And one thing that non-Nazi societies have is respect for the rule of law. But all over the world, international law and domestic law, it's illegal to coerce someone to take a medical procedure, which is why the Supreme Court keeps, not perfectly, but ruling against these mandates. So I guess to you, I would say these people do feel like, I get emails from people saying, I took the injection to keep my job, to pay my mortgage, to feed my family. Now I've got this, or this, side effect, not to alarm anyone. They had no right to do this to me. So those people would say to you, this president did lay out a program of discrimination. He did try to enforce it, and he did force people to undergo harm that they would not have chosen, that they see as harm, that they're experiencing as harm. So that is kind of Nazi-ish to me.
I understand that some people, people were coerced into taking vaccines, and they are being coerced as we speak into taking it. There's no question about that. The question is whether or not it is for the society's good, and B, whether it's for their own good. Okay. This is just one of these things that sometimes, and especially in the midst of a crisis, we take measures that go a little too far, perhaps went a little too far. I'm not sure. It also seems that the effect of these vaccines has been to severely curtail the what do you call it? Toxicity of the disease of coronavirus. The hospitalization and death rates for the vaccinated, especially the boosted vaccinated, is staggering. It's 50 times greater.
And we're getting very different information streams about that. The
Right.
Studies out of Israel show more vaccinated in hospital than unvaccinated, but let's not.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There are. I know what you're talking about there, but then again, you need also break that down by. Okay, I don't want it to be, but lies, damn lies, statistics. I don't want to go there. I think that it is true that there has been some governmental overreach, and that it's not it's not on the basis of race, and that there's an ample history in the United States of that being done. And here, the society was trying to protect itself against what it perceived to be a very contagious, rapidly killing disease. Now, whether that's accurate or not, and whether that there was some whipping into a frenzy on the part of, and is it appropriate for the president of the United States to make some statements, is I'm with you on that. I mean, really, those were intemperate words, in my view.
Well, I thank you. I'm sorry, am I interrupting? I want to hear what you have to
Well,
say.
I do, where I'm going with this is, as bad as those things are, that does not make it, that doesn't make them Nazis.
Okay, fair enough. Fair
Yeah,
enough. All right. So, which is your main?
that's my main point.
Yeah.
I do think something that we might think about is how this is similar to the Tuskegee experiment,
Yes.
which was carried out by the United States government, in which unwitting and unsuspecting soldiers were injected with a known disease, syphilis, and not treated.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Okay, now if you wanted to say that is medical experimentation with malice aforethought carried out by the United States government, I think that is something we need to debate and talk about. And I can tell you, I have a Black son, and I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Brooklyn. And so my interaction with the African American community is daily.
Mhm.
And I had many, shall we say, full and frank exchanges of views with my neighbors, in particular my Black neighbors, over vaccine issues and so on and so forth. And their intense, almost automatic skepticism stems from this event. And we're not talking about it in the mainstream.
No,
And
totally right.
okay, and that to me would be perhaps a more apt metaphorical thing to discuss here. And by the way, we're still feeling the impact of that.
Right.
I love when I read, for example, in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, just to pick a right and a left wing publication. In poor communities in Brooklyn, I pick on Brooklyn because I live there. The vaccination rate is very low, and the infection rate is very high, and this, that, and the other thing. Well, that has a lot to do with the history of the Tuskegee experiment.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that people aren't informed. It's that they're better informed. They know about this aspect of history that commentators in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times refuse to discuss.
I 1000% agree with you, Steve. And I will just chime in there and say that as a woman, it's my knowledge of the history of basically medical experiments on women in the form of thalidomide and, vaginal mesh and
Yes.
estrogen levels and so on that led
Yes.
to my skepticism. Initially, there's plenty of history of, just because they're doctors doesn't mean they're doing the right thing, which no. I want to circle back to a point you made, which I think is so interesting. And it's actually at the heart of the book I just turned in, which is should the state determine what you do with your body for your own good. And this is very dear to my heart. And I just wanted to say, there are people who believe in shock therapy for gay youths because they see it as for that young person's own good to not be gay. And there's a long history, certainly in the 19th century, women who were disruptive and angry were given hysterectomies or clitoridectomies for their own good, right? In fact, there's a feminist history of abuses against women is called For Your Own Good. So right. I just want to circle back to that because there is this argument, and again, for months
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 sec, only to amplify your point, and because in memory of our great teacher, Dr. Boswell, the word hysterectomy, which is derives where our word hysteria comes from, is actually the Greek word for uterus. Uterus and hysteria and are all the same word.
Right.
So and it's indicative of a certain male refusal to accept the personhood of women, that this identifying organ is named for a mental disease.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly right. Yeah,
Right.
she's just crazy.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Boswell, for pointing out as that language is the mother of all meaning. But anyway.
I'd like to invoke Dr. Boswell for a minute here
Yeah.
because, I said in my introduction, I would talk about the impact he had on me. I think his influence is very germane to this discussion.
Mhm.
Probably informs your view, certainly informs mine, because what he taught me, he showed how things like racism and homophobia were cultural constructs, and that they haven't always been with us in our modern form. He showed that they were kind of invented, with an agenda. And I just think that's so important to think about in this moment, because we are there are many times when there's kind of a convulsion or a mass hysteria, to use that term. And I know it's differently, but I see what America has gone through for the last 2 years, what the West has gone through, as having an element of mass hysteria, or
I'll give you that one. Yeah.
hysteria to
Right.
it. And that often happens with real things, like terrorism was like a real thing, but there was a lot of hysteria built up around it. I think a lot of the overreach has been represented in terms that are very essentialist, like this group is a threat to you. And that's the part of what the president kept saying and what Dr. Fauci kept saying that most drove me crazy, because it led to my own people being afraid to hug me, right? Because the science is, there is no difference. Vaccines don't affect transmission. They may affect whether or not you end up severely in the hospital, but they are your decision for your body. That's why I'm asking you, doesn't, my body, my choice, the left has believed that forever. Doesn't that apply to us? Why should someone be forced to be a second-class citizen or take something they don't want to take if their decision only affects them? Maybe you're right. Maybe, maybe I'll die of COVID because I'm vaccinated, but it's my choice. It's not hurting anyone else. I don't go around taking people's cigarettes away from them, or, making them get on the treadmill or whatever. We live in a nation of rights and of bodily autonomy. So where, even if it is, for her own good to force me to do something, like a lot of people argue that it's for my own good to bear a child I don't want, so like where does the right of the individual to make his or her own decisions about this fit into your kind of big picture?
My mother wants you to know that you'd make a great mother. No, when you said about the child, I'm just joking. It's the kind of remark she would make rather than say, I think you should have a child. Okay. Yeah. Okay. No, but no, all joking aside, and that was a joke. I understand your point you're making. And I would contend very strongly that the left does not own the idea that your body is your body. And if you're not hurting anyone else, you do what you want. Okay? So that's not only owned by the left.
Okay.
I would argue that there are a lot of the whole, we're a country which in many ways was defined by our frontier. I mean, we don't, in our time that doesn't exist, but the idea of moving west and manifest destiny and having a frontier and carving out your own destiny and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that a lot of the whole American psyche derives from that.
Right.
And the idea of I'm going to do what I want with my body and my family, blah, 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 that's all very much part of that. And so, and that's not, by no means is that a left-wing concept only.
Right. True.
Okay. Um, so now it's the interesting question is whether or not by you could refuse a COVID virus, which is why in many ways why I think the Nazi thing is not a good metaphor. You can refuse, you just have to quarantine or isolate or whatever the word is. You may have to give up your ability to work with other people and so on. And again, I think these are measures that were taken at the height of a crisis. And yes, they do have some hysterical qualities to them, absolutely. The analogy that comes to mind, of course, is smoking. I think you alluded to it also.
Well, no, respectfully, I don't agree because smoking does affect other people. Secondhand smoke does affect other people, but vaccination does not affect transmission.
Vaccination does not affect transmission. Right, that's true. The question becomes whether by not being vaccinated, I guess you allow the virus to inhabit your body and it can mutate and then come back. Yeah, that becomes a question.
Yeah, I guess that's the narrative again, we have different information streams.
I find that hysterical thinking. I really do. I'm not, I'm not, that's going too far. Like I'm a laboratory, I'm not vaccinated, I'm a laboratory. Okay. Look, there's a crisis going on. It'd be better to say something like there's a crisis going on. We don't really understand this thing. We've only been dealing with it for less than 3 years. Mm-hmm. Okay. The only disease that science has ever wiped out in human history is smallpox.
Right. Right.
Okay. That's it. Yeah. So we don't have a great track record.
But the others became endemic, like this one is becoming endemic.
Yeah,
let's do you mind if I pivot from the science? Because I think you've answered that question of, where is the individual and where is the collective. I want to go back to, again, your main theme, which I found so compelling. Let me ask more generally, do you feel that there's a danger? And if so, what is it? If people in the public sphere bandy about, Holocaust comparisons.
I do. I do. And this goes to my other teacher, Elizabeth Youngrul and Hannah Arendt and so on. Like, I think that we tend to think of the Nazis as like, goose-stepping autocrats, that the Nazism was just a strict form of government, and there have been more liberal and more strict forms of government throughout history. No. Nazism and Stalinism were totalitarianism, unprecedented, totally, these are forms of government which have no precedent. They rely on terror to keep people in line. The final result is to atomize, and what did Hannah Arendt say? That the under totalitarianism, the predominant emotion that people feel is loneliness.
Oh God.
Because that's what characterizes it, because they don't know who they can trust. They don't know who they can talk to. Wow. Members of families, what was going on the Stasi files in East Germany before the fall, 489. I mean, totalitarianism is something very different than just, autocratic governments. And so part A of what I want to say is, let's get historically correct when we're making analogies. Are we really saying that the United States is in danger of becoming totalitarian? That's really a stretch. We haven't set up camps, and we're not exterminating sections of our population. And, there are all kinds of things that go with totalitarianism and how it needs to inflict terror to keep the rest of the population in line, that we don't do. So I that's why it's not. There's another thing which I don't quite know how to word, which is, I'll give you an analogy. We were working together on a piece about Black History Month for our online magazine and online publication.
It was your piece.
Yes, it was a piece that I wrote, and I used a verb we were writing about the some of the great artists of the Harlem Renaissance, and I said I was very jazzed to Baba, be writing this or something, and you advised me to change that word to excited, not because it wasn't an accurate description of how I was feeling, but because not being a Black person, there's something about that is insensitive or appropriating, or there's something about it that is distasteful. Okay. In a very similar way, using Holocaust metaphors about things that if a survivor wants to say this is like that, I guess they have authority and domain to make such a word, to use the word jazzed.
Right,
If I were
right.
Black, I would have used the word jazzed, but I'm not, so I didn't. And I think there's something about the Holocaust that is in the same category. Like I think that the horrors of what went on, and the very few who survived it, like it evokes something so terrible, that I just don't think we should be bandying that about, unless, if God forbid you saw a government trying to exterminate a subsection, if you wanted to say that the Hutsis' attitude towards the Tutsi in Rwanda was Nazi-like, I would say, yeah, that's okay. It's okay to use that metaphor because they rounded them up and slaughtered them.
Right. Understood. Well, that's really well put. I have just two more questions.
Sure.
Since you first wrote your beautiful rebuttal to my essay, Justin Trudeau has declared basically martial law, state of emergency law in Canada. And last Friday, President Biden extended in an open-ended format his Emergency Powers Act, which bypasses Congress in various ways. No terminus point for it. Does that change your view of whether this kind of language should be invoked or not?
No, it doesn't change my point of view. I find I'm troubled by President Biden's extension of emergency powers at a time when the virus, by all counts, is showing signs of receding. You would think he would do the opposite. You would think he would say, I'm going to accelerate the terminus point to, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, we're making great progress, but and I think within 90 days or so, I'm gonna set the terminus point 90 days for something like that. But to leave it open-ended, it is troubling to me. I guess implicit in your question is that like the enabling acts?
No, I'm not going that far. I'm just wondering
Okay.
what you're thinking. And then the last question I have,
Yeah.
which I think is like the deepest point you make of the many beautiful points you make, is, in your essay, you talk about my analogy with, 1930, 1933 being hurtful. And so I think there's a lot to be said about language and pain. And should we, should personal feelings of hurt be brought forward or be dispositive in how other people speak? I think there's a lot to be said there, and I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think this is the point I was saying about I reserve to, except in situations like the Hutu Tutsi situation, where the analogy is, it would be hard not to make the analogy in our time. Except in situations like I guess I reserve to Holocaust survivors, few though they be, the right to use these words and terms. And am I concerned with uh, the offending them or being hurtful towards them, that something not as grave as the Holocaust is being described? I am. I am. And is that probably, is my sensitivity to that heightened by the fact that my family, derives from there were European Jews who were affected by it? Sure, it does.
Right.
Sure, it does. But I don't think that this is the exclusive province of any one group. Many groups were affected by the Holocaust outside of the Jews. I mean, we said before, the Gypsy peoples and Roma, the various names they use, uh, the Russians who died in their millions to combat totalitarianism, so on and so forth. It's like there is a sensitivity towards what they faced. I noticed that all those of us who throw around these metaphors tend to be far away from where things actually happened. I don't see the Russians banding about that metaphor because cuts too close to the bone for them. I don't see the Israelis, which at one point, 50% in the 1950s, 50% of the population of Israel were Holocaust survivors. I mean, the whole section of the population there is, you don't see them banding about these metaphors, and for a reason, because there's, anyway, I hope I'm answering your question. That's why I say hurtful, because I am concerned with hurting the memories of people who survive these things. Not that you would ever do that with malice aforethought. It's just one of these things that I think we trip over.
Gotcha.
That,
Well, sorry, is there more you want to say there?
no, I just said that's why I would have preferred the analogy to ski than to Weimar and the seizure of power by the Nazis at the beginning of their reign. That's why I said it.
And with that, I'm going to give you the last word, because that was a very eloquent and complete summation of your view. And I guess I just want to thank you so much. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I'd like to thank you so much for. Is there?
Russ, first of all, thank you. It was an honor to be here and an honor to be able to contribute to content. I would like to say one thing, which is that here we are, two people with different points of view, and we're hashing out our differences, and we're finding some things that we agree with and some things we don't. And this is how it should be. We're there's no name calling going on here. And I really wish that more of this kind of debate, and it's what makes us Americans, is our ability to come to have a common interest, to hammer out our individual opinions into a common interest. That's what commonwealth means. I'm also indebted to Hannah Arendt for this idea. I think that's important. This is probably, I should have said this earlier, but you brought up Jefferson and projecting backwards into history and so on. One question we have to answer on that is whether or not Jefferson knew better. Okay, because there were people around him that were vehemently opposed to, including Alexander Hamilton. So believe me, they spoke, they debated openly. That's why Jefferson, to me anyway, is a problematic figure.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to echo gratefully what you just said. I was align with what you just said. We've just spent a really meaningful hour sharing our disagreements and respectfully, and that's what we aim to do here at Daily Clout. And yes, I will say personally, I've taken away a lot of insight and wisdom from what you shared, and I will think hard about what you shared. It's helped to inform me better, and I am very grateful to you for engaging in good faith, just like I hope I engaged with good faith with a point of view that you don't agree with, just like I do with your points
And
of view.
I'm very happy to hear it and be influenced by it and to be more sensitive when I talk to other people who share a point of view that is, different than mine about this and many other things. And
And
also,
vice versa.
come on, you're a scholar. I'm a guy who reads too many books. It's an honor to be in a position to have this discussion with you.
You're a beautiful writer and an important contributor to our community, and it's an honor to have your important thoughts. And to everyone else, I hope that you feel empowered and heartened by a demonstration, among other things. Like we sincerely wanted to have this conversation for many reasons, but the medium is the message. We also wanted to share what it can look like when two people really don't agree with each other, but rather than calling names, come together to educate each other and to hash it out.
You bet.
So much, Steven Maslow.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. See you soon.
Everyone, remember to subscribe, donate, support Daily Clout, where you.
Yes, right. The forum where all ideas are welcome. Yes.
Thank you so much. Take
Okay,
care.
bye-bye.
Everyone, it's Naomi Wolf of Daily Clout, and I am asking you to please, if you like the video you just saw, support us, become a member, donate. You can send checks to P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546, or go to Daily Clout, DAILYCLOUT, become a member or donate. Thank you so much for your support. Every penny goes for paying our hardworking staff, paying hosting costs, and paying our lawyers who have been leading the fight to keep you safe and free, to keep the Constitution safe and to keep you free. Thank you so much.